Hello and welcome to the CSN 3M Mindset Monday podcast. I'm Andrew Wade with Case Specific Nutrition. On this channel, we focus on the 3 M's: mindset, myth busting, and mentoring, all as they pertain to health and nutrition. This podcast is brought to you by the OptiLife Academy, Case Specific Nutrition's very own online do-it-yourself wellness course. Be sure to check out our free trial at optilifeacademy.com or by clicking the link below in the show notes. You can use code ANDREW at checkout for 10% off. On today's episode of CSN 3M, we will be discussing BMI versus body fat. It's kind of a continuation of a couple podcasts we've done in the past, one of which looking at body fat itself and understanding it as an organ, and an organ that is essential and one that we need and one that brings a lot of value, but then also one that, like anything else, if we get too much of it, can also lead to some negative dysfunction. And pairing this with and kind of capping off of our talk we had last month about health measures, where we kind of discussed the scale as being an inopportune measure, an inaccurate measure, and sometimes irrelevant measure, depending on what your goal is and what you're trying to accomplish, and most importantly, as you start to better understand the why behind your accomplishments. So I wanted to kind of bring those topics together and provide some insights as to why we use body composition, not exclusively at case-specific nutrition, but why it is a very useful resource and a tool that we use, particularly when we're working with athletes and those that exercise intensely. So first off, to summarize and kind of explain, because I get a lot of people, particularly when they first meet, that they don't actually think there's a difference. So BMI and body fat are often used interchangeably. And it's important to know that there is a difference. The BMI chart is that chart that's at your doctor's office with the green and the yellow and the red and the black and all the numbers. And all it is it's a height to weight measure. So how tall are you and then how much do you weigh? And compare that and run that through an algorithm that gives you a standardized value. And then that value puts you on a chart and compares you to a bunch of other people. And the origin of the BMI chart was they actually did a study back in the 1950s where they weighed and measured people, and then they built a risk analysis where they noticed that people of a higher weight, there seemed to be a correlation with increased risk of chronic disease, diabetes, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and heart disease in particular. And so that became the first study of its kind that actually sort of drew our attention to the fact that we really see a true correlation between those things. But we kind of stopped there initially, and the doctors of the world started to use the BMI chart as a risk measure because of how quick it was. And at the time it was very interesting, but in the world of research and for those of us out here in practice, it is by no means an end-all be-all. It is a very, very oversimplified tool that in many ways does a lot more harm than good. And so that is the BMI chart. When you find out your BMI or your body mass index, you're basically being compared to a bunch of people from the 1950s and said that based on your height and weight, you might be at a higher risk of chronic disease. And where that needs to go from there is we need to ask the question, okay, what would actually increase my risk factors? And this is where we can see where the bridge happens. So on the BMI chart, if you have a BMI above 30, you are classified as obese. And what's rough or tough here is that the obese diagnosis or even definition really means excessive body fat. So not the presence of body fat, because we all need body fat, and we most of us, women need somewhere between 20 and 30%, and men need somewhere between 8 and 20%. We can kind of dig into the detailed numbers, but as a point of reference, we do need body fat. It's one of the most essential organs in our body. It provides us with hormones. It helps us absorb certain nutrients. It has effect on our digestive tract and our emotional well-being, and helps us with testosterone and estrogen, amongst other things. There's a lot of roles of body fat, and when we have too little, we can have some serious danger and dysfunction. But it's worth noting that the definition of obesity is actually excess body fat, which is to say that it's an amount of body fat that is too high in the body, and as a result, those hormones that body fat secretes are getting too loud and are starting to cause dysfunction and imbalances. And so without the presence of inflammation or certain hormones rising, or suggestion of chronic disease development, obesity is not something you can just pinpoint with a height and a weight measure. More importantly, something we have to keep in mind is that your weight is not just fat mass when it goes up and down, right? We are roughly 60% water, which means our water weight varies up and down based on hydration status and how much we're drinking, how much we're moving, how much sodium we consume, how hot it is outside, how fast or slow we're digesting. And so our weight fluctuates pretty dramatically just based on water weight alone. And then in addition to that, we have skeletal mass, how dense are our bones. We have, our organs weigh something. And then the big piece that tends to play in this conversation of BMI versus body fat is then our muscle mass, where our muscle mass is very dense. It's something that weighs a fair amount for how small, right? If you look at how much a pound of muscle is, it's about the size of a tennis ball. It's a pretty small thing to weigh a pound. It's pretty dense, which is kind of neat. And so our weight is composed of all of those things, right? It's our bones, our organs, our muscles, our body water, and our body fat. And we need all of those things. We like to have them in a balance. And so it becomes sort of the downfall of the BMI chart is you can have someone get measured, step on the scale, and then classify them as obese, when in reality they are not actually obese, and saying that obesity means excess body fat. You knowing what they weigh has no bearing or metric of their body fat. It doesn't tell them or tell us that they have excess fat that's leading to inflammatory issues and spikes in your certain hormones and certain processes in the body. Once again, it's a starting point, but it by no means gives us good data or good information. And this becomes particularly true with athletes or for people with more muscle mass, weekend warriors, people that like to exercise. Because when you exercise, particularly if you exercise intensely, the first thing that happens is you challenge your muscles. Those muscles tear, they get sore as they repair, and then they grow back slightly stronger, slightly bigger, and slightly denser. So what happens there? Well, you gain weight. And so a lot of people that are very physically active or very fit on the BMI chart are classified as overweight or classified as obese, which on that chart is saying, oh, there's an increased risk of diabetes or high blood pressure or high cholesterol or higher risk of heart disease. But if someone is physically fit and has extra muscle mass, and that's the reason that their BMI measure is high, that is obviously the opposite is true, right? Someone who's physically fit and exercises intensely is going to have a lower risk of heart disease, a lower risk of diabetes, a lower risk of hypertension, and a lower risk of high cholesterol. So we have to keep in mind the downfall of the BMI measure, and that's in part why at Case Specific and a lot of other places you're seeing the use of body fat percentage. And it's because we do know that, as I've said earlier in this podcast, body fat is essential. We need a certain amount to do all the things, the great things that body fat does for us as a part of our body. That said, too much body fat, if it is too high, can lead to markers of inflammation, can lead to the body to have sort of negative changes that can happen, and can increase the risk of chronic diseases like heart disease and diabetes. And so what we can see is where body fat percentage can oftentimes give us a better view of what's actually going on from a composition perspective. Do we actually have more body fat than we would ideally have from a health perspective? And there's a lot of research, a lot of data that shows those markers, particularly your CRP, your homocysteine, some of your other inflammatory markers that rise when the body fat reaches sort of that excess point. And in addition to that, we see other parts of our body like our tumor necrosis factor and other things all start to misbehave and do things slightly differently. And then we start to see our aldosterone system change, which leads to blood pressure issues. So we can see that there is a tipping point that takes place, but at base, we don't need to know the weight to necessarily see those things. We can look at lab work. We can look at the health of someone's habits. How much are they moving? How well are they eating? How well is the body functioning? How well is the body thriving? To get a much better view where the BMI chart can kind of miss. And so body fat can be a useful way to kind of see where we're at on that spectrum. I know for me, one of my favorite things, if I'm meeting with somebody who's interested in lifestyle change, one of the first things I do, because more often than not, those clients come referred from their doctor, and they've been told, okay, they walk into my office at 350 pounds, and the doctor showed them on their BMI chart that you're 6 feet tall, so you should weigh 186 pounds compared to a bunch of people from the 1950s. And it seems overwhelming, it seems impossible, and to be honest, it's also not correct or accurate, because so often, particularly those who have walked around at a heavier weight, the first thing that happens is you build muscle, right? If you're walking around with extra weight on your body, when you stand up, your legs have to use more energy, which means it's more like a squat. Going up and down stairs becomes exercise. All those things require extra muscle so that you can move that frame around. And so one of my favorite things to do is to help them understand their journey. I instead will take body fat sometimes when it's somebody who's comfortable with that type of metric after we discuss it. And what I love more than anything is when I sit down with someone like for an initial consult, and we take body fat and we say, okay, this is where you're at in terms of body fat percentage. This is how many pounds of fat that is. The normal range for an individual is, this larger, wider range. That means you would be somewhere in this weight range at the conclusion of your weight loss journey, as a side effect of your eating and moving and attention to sleep and attention to stress. And more often than not, that weight range that's given, that's based on body fat, is significantly different from the BMI chart, and it's because it takes their muscle mass into account. I had a client recently walked in my office and weighed around 350 pounds, and we took body fat, and he was a taller guy, right? 6'3", 6'4", former football player, a lot of muscle mass. And when we did the math on it, he had 220 pounds of lean body mass, muscle, bone, skin, organs, water weight. And usually when we start eating well and we start getting into a good routine, we start sleeping better, we can expect to see water weight flush out. So that 220 pounds of lean mass might drop to 205. But more importantly, that 205 pounds of lean mass is meant to be there, right? It's there to stay. And then we need to have some fat mass on top of that. So we looked at what he would weigh between 15 and 20% body fat. And we're looking at weighing 236 to 250. And after he had left his doctor's office being told he needed to weigh 190 pounds, hearing that, oh, I can be in the normal body fat range, I can reduce my risk of body fat, leading to sort of those negative, repercussions in the hormonal aspects and the inflammatory aspects of my body, but I can also still be a big, tall, powerful, fit individual, was extremely exciting to him, made him feel like the journey was much more realistic, and allowed us to then shift our conversation to the how, which becomes my favorite topic. And I think we talked about this a couple times in some other podcasts. It's the idea of living like the lighter you. So once we kind of saw that he would likely feel his best in that 240 range, we said, okay, how does he live, right? What does he do day to day? How does he like to move? What's his job? How does he eat? When does he, eat meals? Where do the meals fall in with family and with loved ones? What are his social outlets? How often does he like to have a beer on a Friday night? All that good stuff. We start to then spend the rest of our time living like the leaner version of him, learning those habits that feel great, and then the body follows suit, right? The body adjusts in accommodation with those habits and with those awarenesses. So body fat has a potential to be a really positive understanding. If we can use it as a tool to help people understand their frame, you have a lot of muscle mass or you have a lot of lean mass, and then better understand how they fit, it allows us to really individualize and then customize the health journey that they're on. And again, instead of having to get attached to this BMI measure that puts a scale range in that's really based on outdated data, again, an interesting study that has been used literally for way too long. One of the other things I find useful about body composition that I think is relevant to bring up for those of you listening is to understand what your journey is. And so Now more than ever, there's this big movement towards intense exercise, right? I see a lot of businesses starting up that do different interval trainings and high intensity trainings and high heart rate trainings and boxing and heavy lifting, and I love it. It's great to see such different dynamic type activities. It's great to see exercise that's really stimulating. But what a lot of people are seeing is they want to exercise like athletes, and I think that's great as long as we understand what that means, because to exercise like an athlete is to challenge the body to build muscle. And this is where this becomes an important distinction, is if I sat down with somebody and they told me that for the next month they were going to start lifting weights 3 days a week, doing intervals, hill sprints twice a week, and then they were going to have a couple games of basketball throughout the week. The first thing I would hear is an increase in resistance training, which is going to stimulate muscle to grow denser and larger. An increase in high intensity interval training, burst strength in the form of sprints and basketball, which is going to once again condition the muscle to grow. So what's the first thing that's going to happen to them if they're using the scale? They're going to gain weight. But that's the important thing to understand, right? Is if your goal is to improve your fitness, that means your goal is to increase your muscle mass, which means a quote unquote weight loss journey is not the whole picture, right? The scale is not going to tell you everything that's happening. You're going to step on it and it might go up, it might go down, but you have no idea what that means, because at the end of the day, you're building muscle, you're tearing muscle, which means you're causing inflammation, you're increasing water retention, your muscles are pulling more carbs and water into them for the purposes of energy. There's all these things going on, and those all are great positive effects that are happening because of your exercise, but it's making it hard for a lot of individuals to take it seriously. And so I've met with a lot of people over the years that come in to see me frustrated because they started exercising intensely and they say the scale didn't go down, right? Or I went to the doctor and my scale didn't go down and my BMI didn't go down, and they told me I need to lose weight, but I've been doing so great and I've been feeling so great. And then they get discouraged and quit, which I hope you can hear what I just said, right? I feel great, I love what I'm doing, I quit. That makes no sense, and it's because we're using the wrong measures to capture the positive, right? Increasing muscle mass, increasing exercise, increasing the mitochondria and the muscle cells that lead to better use of energy systems. Those are all positive factors. Those are all things that make you physically run better, physically healthier. And regardless of what the scale says, you are a healthier person because of it. But once again, based on your journey, if your journey is to get more fit, right, is to improve your fitness, which means you intend to exercise intensely, and then you want to work on your learning to fuel your body properly, the first thing that's going to happen is you're going to build muscle, which means if your expectation is I'm going to measure my progress by the scale changing, you are going to be frustrated and deceived, because the scale doesn't measure muscle gain and it doesn't show you the swap of muscle going up while body fat percentage tends to trend down. Body fat percentage, on the other hand, does do that. We can take body fat after someone eats with good intention and good spread of food and fuels their body, and then really challenges their body to new movements and new activity types. That is going to lead to an increase in muscle mass and a decrease in fat mass, which a body fat percentage would tell us. So you can sit down and say, oh, wow, in the last month, I built 2 pounds of muscle and lost 4 pounds of fat. And then more importantly, we know the body fat range. It varies widely from person to person, which is why at our group we also will take lab work to monitor inflammatory markers like CRP and homocysteine and some of the others, our fasted insulin and some other things that can give us a better indicator of, hey, when we first sat down, the labs suggest that there was some hormonal dysfunction that was likely related to having the body sort of out of balance. And through the eating well and through the moving well and through the stress relief or stress alterations and through improving our sleep, we can see the stress markers going down. We can see the body fat percentage entering a normal range. And all of those things are leading you to be more mobile, have less pain in the joints, and really feel better overall. And so it's a really important distinction to understand based on what your journey is. So I want you to take a moment, if you're somebody who's working on your health or working on your fitness, to ask yourself what you're actually working on, right? And more importantly, then look at what you're doing, the actions you're taking, and ask yourself what you would expect those to do. And if you're doing some sort of resistance training or some sort of lifting or some sort of high intensity explosive movements, you should not be using the scale as your guide. We should be realizing that that is going to stimulate muscle. So you should be using strength, you should be using endurance, you should be using stamina, you should be using power output, improvements in your ability to do the workouts, improvements in your ability to recover from the workouts. Those are all measures that your heart and your lungs and your muscles are working better. And then from there, is your body changing in a way that's allowing you to move better through space, right? Are you noticing that your low back and your hips aren't in as much pain, or your ankles and your knees aren't as sore, and your body is maybe standing more upright? Those are all signs that when we're working on our fitness, that the body is improving for the better. And if we're fueling properly, we're fueling foods that keep the body from becoming overly inflamed or overly fatigued. We're allowing the muscles to recover. We're keeping energy levels stable. We're keeping mood stable, and we're keeping the body in a good place so that all this hard work you're putting in really can show you a change. But most importantly, you need to make sure you understand what kind of change are you coming to. So I hope this has been helpful for everyone out there listening that's currently working on their fitness and health and is perhaps not measuring their habits properly, is using the scale when the scale is really not the best way to be measuring habits. There's so many subjective measures that you can use to tangibly see that your body is changing and your fitness is changing. And then from there, for those of you who do like objective numbers and do like to like data, and that's a positive thing for you, body fat percentage can be one of the better ones because it allows you to see the fat mass and the lean mass, which allows us to capture how much muscle you're gaining. And then if you are somebody who has extra body fat, that might be changing your hormones and might be changing your body and maybe causing inflammation and also sort of irritating joints and things. We can monitor that fat mass reduction and make sure we can see that correlate and see all the lab measures and the subjective measures go along with it. And then from there, make sure that you get into a range that's healthy. Because on the other side, we see the same problem where we get people, particularly athletes now, and in large part, I think it's just because of social media and magazines that, when we think of an athlete, we think of a guy with a shredded six pack and a ton of veins. But unfortunately, the reality to that is having 4% body fat, which is what gets you on the cover of a magazine, really does very little from a performance perspective for most people. That usually means that you're in a starved and depleted and dehydrated state, which means you're not performing to your best. And so when I work with athletes who are really working on adjusting their body composition for performance purposes, we need to find that sweet spot, right? What's the body comp where you're lean enough that your body isn't getting in your own way, meaning it's not weighing you down, it's not changing your form, but on the other side, you're not losing your power. And that's where you can hear why people that do cardiovascular training like biking and running are going to tend to be lighter, right? It's because one, they have a lighter type of muscle that's a little less dense. But then in addition to that, they are also a type of person, they don't need a lot of power per se, right? Long distance runners, long distance bikers don't need a lot of power. They just need stamina. They need to be able to go and go and go. And that's not to say that having some muscle doesn't help, because absolutely it does. But your kick, your sprint, having that ability to push at the end of a 1 mile race requires a good balance of type 1 muscle, which is the muscle runners have, and then some good type 2 muscle that gives us a burst. Where we shift over to someone like a sprinter, where they're going to have a lot more of a denser muscle, they're going to have more muscle mass to them. But then we can see, as we transition to more of a power sport like a rowing, there's going to be a benefit or a balance to having a certain amount of muscle and a certain amount of stamina, but then also some weight that allows you to leverage and power. And then from there, we can hear where powerlifters would benefit from being heavier, and that's because they're trying to move weight, they're trying to create power, so they need that as a leverage point. So it's kind of an interesting thing for athletes, because we can see based on what type of athlete you are, your composition is going to vary a little bit, the muscle mass is going to vary a little bit, but no matter what, there is a sweet spot for each individual in terms of what they do, what their goals are, what they're trying to accomplish, and the body that's going to carry them there. And what's neat is all of us at base have this phenomenal body that is doing incredible things for us. We take for granted the fact that even as I sit here in my office, my heart's beating, my lungs are expanding and contracting, my brain and my nerves are going a million miles an hour. All these things are happening. My immune system's functioning, my body temperature is at 98.6. The body is keeping all of these things regulated and in homeostasis, sort of underneath, and subconsciously we're not even aware of what's all happening. And then from there we take this body, and there's ways for us to basically fuel it properly and train it properly so that we can accomplish a goal that we set out for. And if that goal is athletics, then body composition can be a good way to monitor changes in muscle mass and make sure body composition is falling in the right place so that there's adequate power and adequate energy. And if that goal is really health, then we can be looking at our systems and making sure the body is really doing what we want it to be doing and really listening to us and responding, and is thriving in its environment, and do everything we can to set it up to do so. So once again, I'm hoping that the comparison of the BMI versus the body fat is a really useful one for everyone listening. There is a constant misunderstanding of BMI and body fat. And more importantly, I hope that we can hear where there's a lot of good subjective measures and the use of body composition, really for those who are seeking to better understand their progress, right? We can be really happy with where we're at now, and we can be really excited to make changes that continue to allow us to feel better and better. And body composition is just one of the resources that's available for us. To those of you out there that are exercising intensely and monitoring the scale, perhaps use this as a time to better understand that your intense exercise is changing your body composition, not your body weight per se. And just as an easy reflection of that, I think most people out there would consider Serena Williams an athlete, right? She's one of the most spectacular athletes on the planet. She's probably one of the most athletic women we've ever seen, in recorded history. And she is roughly 6 feet tall. She's around 200 pounds. And by BMI standards, she's considered overweight or obese. But from a body fat percentage, she is very lean. And the reason is because of how much muscle she has, right? And so we can see where her intense training, her intense fueling, her intense exercise has made her an absolutely incredible athlete that is fast and powerful and has stamina. And her exercise routine that a lot of people try and emulate when they go to the various high-intensity interval training classes. That's what that does. It builds muscle, it fuels the body, and now she exercises so intensely and so much, it's unlikely that any of us ordinary mortals out there would chase her down in terms of her level of fitness. But she's a very good polarizing example of where the BMI chart fails us. It doesn't really tell us the whole picture, particularly those who like to exercise, and where body fat can be a data point that allows us to see, oh wow, look at the lean mass, look at the muscle mass. Is the body fat present and appropriate? Oh no, this person's too lean and would actually benefit from having more body fat so that their hormone levels can be higher and their recovery rates can be better. Or this person has more body fat than their body would benefit from, as evidenced by the body fat measure and some hormonal measures. And from there, let's see if we can get it into a normal range through positive lifestyle awarenesses and allow the body to show us that it's really thriving. So I hope this has been an interesting episode. I'd like to thank you as always for listening. Please subscribe to our channel and share with your friends and family on your favorite social media, tagging our hashtag #SpreadTheHealth. For more case-specific nutrition content, please follow us on social media at Case Specific Nutrition. And don't forget to check us out on our website at casespecificnutrition.com. You can send us an email, ask us a question. We're always more than happy to work, to help other people better understand things, clarify any points. And we do both in-person and virtual visits. So if you want to meet with a dietitian, there's an opportunity to discuss and better understand your health journey. So thanks again for taking the time to listen. We will be back next week with another CSN 3M Mindset Monday.